Blessed Savior, He's worthy to be praised. Praise Him, praise Him, praise Him, praise Him. Jesus, blessed Savior, He's worthy to be praised. From the rising of the sun until the going down of the same, He's worthy. Jesus is worthy. He's worthy to be praised. Praise Him, praise Him, praise Him, praise Him. Jesus, blessed Savior, He's worthy to be praised. From the rising of the sun until the going down of the same, He's worthy. Jesus is worthy. He's worthy to be praised. Praise Him, praise Him, praise Him, praise Him. Jesus, blessed Savior, He's worthy to be praised.
Ready to go. We've got some tremendously exciting and informative plenary sessions coming up. We have here Dr. Jacoby Wilson. The brother is a down-to-earth heavyweight on environmental justice. He's passionate about protecting our communities from the types of pollutants and manufacturing operations that cause cancer and asthma and a wide variety of different afflictions and ailments. I met Dr. Wilson, as I said yesterday, at a forum, a Watershed Stewards Forum in West Virginia. And after he gave this presentation, I realized that he had passion to protect our communities from the kind of things that not only have a negative impact on our environment, but affect our own health. He is a associate professor at the University of Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Dr. Wilson has had 15 years of experience in the environmental health field in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, exposure science, crowd science, community-based participatory research, and many other areas. He's very active professionally. He's a part of various environmental organizations and on several different nonprofit boards. He is someone to listen to. Today, he's going to come and talk to us about climate change. He's going to help us understand what it is. He's going to give us some insight into how it's affecting the earth, our planet, our community. And then he's going to give us a call to action to talk about what can we do to mitigate climate change. And so here and now, please listen to our good friend and our brother, Dr. Jacoby Wilson.
Thanks again for having me. I'm happy to be back today. Hopefully this presentation is not too academic-y, but I'm gonna try to keep it some real talk today. climate change is the climate crisis is one of the biggest issues of our time. And you ask other guy who just mentioned it, what is climate change? We had to talk to you about what is climate change. So you get about since this industrial revolution, and bear with me, y'all. Again, I think the slides may be a little over the top. I needed to translate them better, but I'm gonna try to translate these slides for you. So you see a lot of increase in carbon dioxide emissions. Think about the industrial revolution. We have a lot of factories, right? We have a lot of. You think about we went from horse-drawn carriage to having automobiles. So you have mobile sources of pollution burning fossil fuels, right? We talked about that yesterday. We have stationary sources, power plants, others burning fossil fuels, burning coal, right? When you drive your car, you may burn gasoline. When you drive a big truck or bus, you may burn diesel. Your homes may be heated with natural gas. That's a euphemism, y'all. That's gas. That's fossil gas. That's from dinosaurs, but that's a separate point. And so when you combust these fuels, we create greenhouse gases. You've heard of the greenhouse gas effect. Some of these greenhouse gases are CO2. You have methane. And so those emissions change our climate. As you see from the chart, the map on the right side of the panel, you see mean temperature changes in across the world. And so we've seen major changes in temperature over time. We've seen major changes in precipitation over time. And this is what we call man-made. One term you may have heard before is anthropogenic, anthro, man. So these are man-made changes. These are not natural changes. These are changes due to what we do to the planet, right? Changes because of our consumerism. The cars we drive, the fuels that we use, and there's impacts on our natural systems. There's impacts on our various cycles, the hydrologic cycle, the Gulf Stream. Uh, there's impacts on air quality. There's impacts that you heard before probably about the ozone layer. Some of these emissions can impact our ozone layer. Okay, so these are things that contribute to a change in climate. And so, because of these forces, man-made forces, these emissions, greenhouse gases, you see increases in average temperature over time. We had, I think, a warmest year in the history of the planet was last year, and that keeps happening every year. You've heard about increase in sea level. Antarctica and the polar ice sheets melting. The air temperatures over ocean. Think about the air temperature over the Gulf Coast. Part of the reason why you send so many hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, you have this engine, right, of heat that's there over the Gulf Coast. So you're seeing last year we had the most named storms to hit the Gulf Coast in the history of naming storms. For those of you who may be in the fraternity sorority, we got in the high levels of those alphabets, right, that we normally don't do, right, last season. And that's because, again, of the greenhouse gases. So impacting surface temperatures over land, impacting temperatures over the sea, impacting our ocean currents, okay, impacting the amount of water vapor, impacting rain patterns. Some places are receiving less rain. You may have heard about the droughts in California and the constant droughts in California. You hear in other parts of the world where they're dealing with more tsunamis. So so we deal with hurricanes in our part of the world. Other parts of the world, those storms are called tsunamis. And you have the issue of desertification, where because of lack of rain, areas that are more green and lush are becoming deserts. So folks are not able to grow food. And in the other parts of the world, not hurricanes in this part of the world, typhoons, I'm sorry, in other parts of the world as well. And you think about increased amounts of rain that some parts of the world are receiving. So some places are receiving less rain, and other places are receiving more rain. We know that this year, and I'll get to a slide, in the Pacific Northwest, you had some really high temperatures. I believe Death Valley had its highest temperature on record. Parts of the Northwest, like during the summertime, are usually cooler. They broke their daily records. You remember from Hurricane Ida, that when it hit New Jersey and New York, broke rainfall records. And unfortunately, you saw some residents who were living in basement apartments because they were not able to live in other residential areas because of their income. They weren't able to make it out and escape from those rainwaters. And some people, unfortunately, also, as they were driving through flooded areas, it's hard to see when areas are flooded. They weren't able to escape. So these climate change is having real impacts on people's lives. And if you think about the health effects of climate change, so I'm gonna talk more about this urban heat island issue, but you have heat related mortality. So I talked a little bit about redlining, right? So if you and highways being built through black and brown communities, what does that mean as it relates to climate change? Well, you have a lot of concrete and asphalt in our communities, a lot of impervious surfaces. What's impervious mean? So when it rains, when you have impervious surfaces, where that water go? The water doesn't have any place to go, right? So you get a lot of stormwater runoff. But also because you have a lot of concrete in the asphalt, that means what that concrete and asphalt absorbs that heat, right? Those areas that have more concrete in the asphalt are warmer. But also because of the highways and byways, right? You have the air pollution that's emitted, right? The combustion byproducts. When I talked about particulate matter, dust in the air, other compounds. So those are heat trapping, right? Those are heat trapping pollutants. So it's already hot. You got asphalt and concrete absorbing heat and re-releasing the heat. You got combustion byproducts that are trapping heat, right? That creates that urban heat island. And then because you built the highways and byways of the communities, we don't have trees. So trees are part of the natural infrastructure that can help do what? Mitigate the impacts of heat. You know how it is when you have a tree in your yard and how it keeps you cool. Shade. Being from Mississippi, the old saying about drinking some iced tea under the tree, right? And that having those trees are really beneficial to keeping areas cool. Okay, but when you don't have trees, you don't have that natural infrastructure to keep those locations cool. And then going back to this issue of structural poverty, if you live in an urban community that has a lot of concrete and asphalt, you don't have trees, and you may be living in row houses or rental homes, rental housing, you may not have air conditioning. So you don't have the mechanical infrastructure to help mitigate heat. So air conditioning helps with mitigate heat mechanically. Trees help mitigate heat naturally. But again, if you have your AC running, right, and your power source is coming from a coal-fired power plant, then that's also your source power, what your power's been generated. That's also contributing again combustion byproducts and greenhouse gas emissions like CO2. Okay, so you think about as temperatures change, as temperatures rise, you may see increases in different types of vector-borne diseases. So, for example, mosquitoes carry various diseases. So you may see more mosquitoes that carry diseases. You may see more issues with waterborne diseases. So some of you know about maybe heard of Vibrio cholera. For those of you in the Chesapeake Bay region, Vibrios, you can be exposed to those. Maybe exposed to E. coli, other things that cause diarrhea. And of course, when you have droughts, that means you have less food. That can lead to population and having malnutrition. And I believe in Ethiopia right now, they're dealing with a major drought issue, and due to climate change and malnutrition. Then you look at issues of then you look at issues of um, the droughts, floods, and storms themselves. When you're in a storm, as I talked about with Hurricane Ida, you could lose your life during that storm. Or remember from Hurricane Maria, people didn't have electricity for months. That means you're not able to get access to certain medicines and certain supplies. Think about if you're in a hurricane, and this happened last year, Gulf Gulf storms that hit the Gulf Coast, where you had COVID-19 and your power goes out. If you're on a ventilator, if you're getting dialysis, you don't have electricity. So people sometimes lose their lives, unfortunately, not because of the event itself, but in the aftermath because they don't have access to power. Okay, and then with the combustion byproducts, when we burn fossil fuels again, right? When we're burning the diesel, when we're burning the gasoline, when we burn coal, it produces combustion byproducts that creates air pollution. And remember, those air pollutants can impact human health, cause asthma, cause cancer, cause heart disease, mutate your DNA, impact reproduction. And so these are things you have to think about, right? So there's the direct effects of climate change on health, and there's the indirect effects of climate change on health. And so the folks who contribute the least to greenhouse gases are the ones who are impacted most by climate change. We just had the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, right? I think today is the last day in Scotland. This is the meeting where a lot of the countries come together to talk about how we're going to address climate change, how we're going to make sure we don't the temperature gets too high, that was going to lead to more sea level rise, more melting of polar ice caps. There's an island nation right now that's disappearing. There's multiple island nations that are disappearing. Again, these things are contributing to droughts. I mean, one of the biggest drivers of refugees in the world right now is not war per se, it's climate change, which leads to resource disputes, right? Climate change is producing more displacement than any other major driver in the world right now. So again, but the places who are most impacted, those populations are the ones contribute the least to those greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the same thing in the US. In the US, folks of color, Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, as I said in the presentation yesterday, we're not producing the greenhouse gases, but we're being differentially impacted by the greenhouse gas emissions, differentially impacted by climate change. We have differential climate risks. So when it comes to climate change, folks of color are hit first and worst. That's a statement from Dr. Robert Bullard, known again as the father of the EJ movement. So who's vulnerable to climate change? Children are vulnerable. Why is that? Well, you think about children when it comes to if there's a disaster event, a flood event, a hurricane event, they're not able to protect themselves. Also, they're more fragile when it comes to air pollution. Children breathe in more air per kilogram body weight compared to adults. So kids bring in more air than we do. So if you're in an area that has more air pollution, that kid's going to be more impacted, have a higher risk to have adverse health effects like asthma. When you think about climate change, the elderly, for opposite reasons in some ways, the immune system's breaking down. Some elderly folks may be isolated. So if there's a climate event like a hurricane, can you get to them? Can you get them out of there, right? They may be immobile. They may have underlying health issues. And folks, again, with COVID-19, I mentioned COVID-19. If you have underlying health conditions, you're going to be more at risk during a climate event, a hurricane, a forest fire, a flood event, a heat wave. Remember the Chicago heat wave in 1995? We had a lot of elderly folks of color who died, right? Folks are dealing with health disparities. You're going to have higher risk when it comes to, again, climate-related perturbations, sea level rise, flooding, heat waves, forest fires, droughts, hurricanes. Low-income folks, why? They may live in areas where they're in closer proximity to hurricane zones. They may not have access to healthcare, health insurance. One of the things I'll say it now, y'all remember back to Hurricane Katrina, 16 years ago, right? Was it August 29th, 16 years ago? So New Orleans, I'm from Mississippi. I love New Orleans, but New Orleans is a very segregated city and a lot of poverty in New Orleans. A lot of the folks of color who are in poverty, they didn't have a car. So how do you expect folks to get out of a hurricane zone when you may be low income, you don't have a car. Then remember also, y'all, the hurricane hit at the end of the month. If you're low income, you probably haven't been paid yet. So how do we expect folks to get out of harm's way when they don't have a car and they haven't been paid? I talked about environmental justice yesterday. You know, communities that are overburdened by hazards, they've been already dealing with the cumulative impacts of pollution. They already under stress from toxic trauma. So climate change is increasing their health risks. Folks who don't have a voice, folks who've been invisibilized by our policies in the U.S. are at risk too. You have folks who live in rural areas, folks who live in Appalachia, brothers and sisters live on reservations, brothers and sisters that live in the colonias along the Mexico-Texas border, folks that live in areas that are prone to flooding. And then if you don't have access to good infrastructure, right? If you don't have access to good infrastructure, you don't have access to climate resilient infrastructure. If you remember I said before, you got folks who are living who have unjust housing, unjust transportation, unjust food, right? Unjust sewer water infrastructure. Those also adds to your risk when it comes to climate change and climate related events. If you have poor housing stock, you're going to probably be at risk of losing your home during an event and maybe not having flood insurance to take care of their home, right? Because FEMA's formula is really based on the value of that home. So if you're already economically depressed, right, and you want to rebuild your home, you're not getting the money you need to fully rebuild that home. So it's not really taking into account the sort of structural poverty and racism that makes those homes less value in the first place. Okay. If you live in a rural area and you're on well water and there's a hurricane, you're going to be at risk of not having a safe drinking water source. So NWCP did a report that talked about, the location of power plants. And basically, we see that a lot of these power plants are located close to folks of color, located close to low-income folks. So our communities are hosting a lot of these power plants. Again, when you burn fossil fuels, it creates combustion byproducts that can have a negative impact on human health, but also greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. Another report, fumes across the fence line. More than 1 million African Americans live within half a mile of existing natural gas facilities, right? So natural gas is, and remember, it's a euphemism, it's fossil gas, dinosaurs. It's been touted as a solution, as an energy solution. Let me tell y'all something. When we burn gas, you still get those same combustion byproducts. Maybe not the amount that you get from coal-fired power plants, right? When you burn coal, but you still are impacting the environment, releasing greenhouse gases like methane, and you're impacting human health. So again, our communities are being used as a sacrifice zones for these fossil fuel infrastructure, where when you have emissions, those emissions, again, greenhouse gas emissions, are things that are impacting, leading to increasing the risk of climate change. Let me skip this one. So here's just a visual that shows that you have a facility that's burning, coal. You see the emissions, and then if you live nearby, remember, as it just said, but NLCP, we're living close to these facilities, so you're gonna have a higher risk of being exposed. So think about, again, those kids who live near that facility. You got daycare centers and schools near these facilities. Think about the elderly folks that live near these facilities, right? People with asthma that live near these facilities. And then that pollution creates smog, which also impacts human health. So, this climate crisis is just a few examples of the things you may have heard about, may not have heard about. The red tide, toxic algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. Remember the winter storm that happened, and they weren't prepared for it in Texas? I mean, a lot of people who passed away, they passed away because when that power went out, they didn't have a backup, a safe backup source. So what did they do? Folks were burning charcoal in their home and get exposed to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is odorless, it's invisible. And so a lot of cases, the folks who died from carbon dioxide poison were low income folks. So when you think about climate change and we talk about extreme weather events, we're just not talking about, extreme heat events. We're just not talking about, hurricanes. You can also have extreme winter storms. You look at in Europe, there's been issues with, major storms. You look at Hurricane Harvey a few years ago in Houston. Hurricane Harvey dumped 30 trillion, I'm gonna say it again, 30 trillion gallons of rain. And any of y'all know about Houston? Houston is the petrochemical capital of the country, the Houston Ship Channel. So most of the folks who live in these petrochemical operations are people of color. So when that hurricane came through and all that rain came through, it flooded a lot of those facilities. So people had to wade through a toxic soup to escape. In the same way you saw people escaping out of New Orleans, New Orleans also has petrochemical operations. So people were wading through a toxic soup to get out of harm's way, right? And then you also had air pollution emissions like volatile organic compounds. You may be asking, what's the VOC, Dr. Wilson? That new car smell? Those gonna get a new car. You should hold your breath. Those are VOCs. Those are not good for your health. Remember I talked about yesterday how the kids going to school, having to put American person put our kids first. Where when you burn diesel, some of the contaminants that are created are volatile organic compounds. Those are things that I didn't say specifically, but VOCs are things that impact your short-term focus, your ability to learn. Okay, and so VOCs are a major combustion byproduct. And so if you live near a petrochemical operation, you're going to be impacted by VOCs. But that's what happened with Hurricane Harvey. So what are these sectors that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? A lot of it comes from agriculture, concentrated animal feeding operations, forestry. A lot of it comes from transportation, but a good chunk of it comes from heating our homes. The air conditioning, so heating and cooling, and also a big chunk comes from industry. So when you think about, again, the impacts, there's an infrastructure issue, as I've already kind of covered in previous slides. So we have inadequate infrastructure to address the consequences of climate change. Housing issues, I talked about redlining. So in areas that have been historically redlined, as I said yesterday, these are the areas where you see more urban heat islands, and you see a 10 to 12 degree difference in redline areas versus non-redline areas in the U.S. And that's a study done by Shondas, who's at Portland State University. And so if you live in these redline areas, areas are segregated, you got urban heat islands, you're going to see, more flood issues. Remember with Hurricane Katrina, right? The lower ninth is that, for those New Orleans is a lower elevation. New Orleans is a bowl. The wealthier folks were the higher elevation. So people were flooded out, in many cases, with people who were low income because they were at below sea level. So your income drives, what elevation you're at in New Orleans. So African American communities, again, getting back to the redlining issues, receive C's and D's from a homeowners loan corps in the 30s and 40s. So those same homes today are energy efficient. The folks are spending a lot of that money on their energy bill to keep the house heated, the house cool, and it leads to, again, heat related illnesses. And so as temperatures continue to increase across this country, for folks who live in these energy inefficient homes, the heating and cooling will continue to be an issue. So you're going to have a higher energy cost. We call it energy poverty, energy injustice. Well, at the same time, you're going to be exposed to pollutants too, and then be at risk of heat-related morbidity, like heat stroke, or dying from heat issues. So the two maps that show in Cleveland, Ohio, the green grades, the red line, you see the green versus red. And as you see areas that were more red, when you move to the map on the right, you see they have a higher annual income spent on energy. So if you're in the red line area, you're spending more of your annual income on energy compared to homeowners who are in the green area. Okay, so redlining was a racist practice. So historic racism is impacting our ability to deal with climate change, our experience with climate change today. So these urban heat islands, again, these are parts of the city that are warmer because of asphalt and concrete and a lack of green space. Okay, and so you just think about again the consequences. I already said: heat stroke, heat exhaustion, impaired water quality. And those folks of color are impacted, but people who are low income are more impacted because you got a lot of low income folks of color who live in urban areas, and so they live in these heat domes. So what can we do to address this? We gotta have climate resilience. We need to make sure communities are more engaged when it comes to planning and development, and more access to jobs and economic opportunities, and having meaningful civic engagement so we can move away from fossil fuels. So we can say no to the new highway through our communities. So we can say yes to better, more energy efficient housing. So we can say yes to expanding tree canopy. Yes to electrification, right? I have a few slides on the new infrastructure bill, and I'll try to talk through that a little bit to link it to the issues of climate change. I already talked about the power crisis a little bit, but there were 4.5 million Texans without power and extreme cold. Okay, and so we have to have backup systems. And Texas is all about big oil and big gas. So how can we have to move to a clean energy economy and clean energy resources? So what happened with the Texas power crisis doesn't happen again. And then and I talked about a heat dome a couple of seconds ago, but the heat dome that just happened in the Pacific Northwest, you had 108 degrees Fahrenheit in Seattle, record, 116 in Portland, record, 121 British Columbia, record, right? British Columbia, they had 500 unexpected deaths during the heat wave. Okay, this is a part of the country like during that time of the year normally that they're in the 70s and 80s. So major heat issues, and this is all contributed due to climate change. I talked about Katrina already, but Dr. Bullock just want to say real quickly, he talks about the complexion for protection. And the issue is there's inequity in preparedness, response, and recovery when it comes to climate-related events. And of course, you saw that with Hurricane Katrina. And then remember, a few months ago, on the same day that Katrina hit, 16 years later, Hurricane Ida hit New Orleans. Okay? And so you're going to see this pattern again of Gulf storms and hurricanes hitting that part of the country, whether it be New Orleans, whether it be Galveston, Texas, or whether it be Houston, Texas. And again, the folks who are on the front line of being hit and impacted consistently, disproportionately, are again people of color and low wealth folks. So let me just highlight Princeville. Some of y'all may have heard of Princeville, may know about Princeville. Princeville was a freedmen's community. And as you know, many folks of color, once they were free, they weren't allowed to go live, in the white communities. They weren't allowed to settle in places that were, nice places to settle. They had to settle where, y'all? In the floodplain, in the swamps. So what's past this prologue? Okay. Now you think about climate change, these freedmen's communities, these communities we have a lot of black folk in rural, semi-rural areas of the deep south. If they were settled in the floodplain, flood zone, in the swamp, they're going to be at risk for sea level rise. They're going to be at risk of flooding due to a hurricane. And we see this happening time and time again now in our communities. And this just shows you what happened in Princeville due to Hurricane Floyd. Hurricane Floyd and Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Floyd hit North Carolina back in 1999. And Hurricane Matthew was it now 8 years ago? So what are some policies? What are some policies out there? So we had the Paris Climate Agreement that the previous administration stepped out of, and the goal again is for us to as countries around the world to come up with agreements to reduce our greenhouse gases and our energy emissions. Um, we with this new administration, we stepping back into being a leader or trying to be a leader when it comes to climate change globally. Um, we have Executive Order 14008. So I can explain the executive order a little bit. It requires each agency to create a climate action plan. So Department of Energy, Department of Defense, U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Health and Human Services, FEMA, Homeland Security, USDA, Housing, Transportation, Department of Interior. All the federal agencies had to create a climate action plan. It also led to creation of an interagency working group on environmental justice called the IEC. Interagency Council, the Interagency Council on Environmental Justice, White House Council, and also they have another group called WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So you have the Interagency Council, the IAC, then you have the WEJAC, which has a lot of EJ advocates, and one of the big parts of the of Executive Order 14008 is called the Justice 40 Initiative. So as we move from a fossil fuel dirty fuel economy to a clean energy economy, 40% of the benefit of that transition should go to disadvantaged communities. So this is an opportunity for us to really make sure that our communities who have differential climate risk, again, from heat, from flooding, sea level rise, from hurricanes, from droughts, from forest fires, those vulnerable populations, susceptible populations, that we can get investments and benefits to make sure those communities are more climate resilient. So when you think about the Justice 40 Initiative, they're going to have a mapping tool that allow us to map those communities that we need to identify and prioritize communities so we can bring those dollars, bring those new infrastructures in those communities. And I think the infrastructure bill that just passed is an opportunity to really make Justice 40 have some teeth and have some dollars behind it. So other initiatives across the country that you may or may not be aware of, there was a major climate act signed in New York in 2019 with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 4% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. And they want to go to 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. So what does that mean? They're going to have to be using wind. They're going to have to be using solar. They're going to be using maybe geothermal, maybe hydrogen. These are things that you may or may not know about, but these are renewable resources. And again, coal, gas, diesel, anything that's taken out of the ground. When you burn trash from an incinerator, those are called non-renewable. So we want to move to a clean energy future. We got to move from non-renewable resources to renewable resources. There was an act passed in California called the 100% Clean Energy Act of 2018. Requires renewable energy and zero carbon sources to supply 100% of electric retail sales by 2045. So they want to move, to vehicles that don't burn diesel, that don't burn gasoline, that are electric. Okay. Then you also had another bill called the Clean Economy Act of 2020. And this is a bill to get electricity generated from 100% renewables. So you see in different states across the country pass these bills. New York is one of the best bills. Washington State passed a bill called the Climate Commitment Act last year. And so you're seeing similar kind of goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And remember, again, these greenhouse gas emissions and the co-pollutants that impact human health, they differentially impact our communities. They differentially impact communities of color. They differentially impact low wealth communities. Now, here's some text on the infrastructure bill, and I'm sorry it's not as clean as I wanted to be, but there's money in there for roads. There's money in there for highways, which is probably not the best thing. We need to have more dollars in mass transit. Now, this shows there's $39.2 billion in here for mass transit. So that means if we can get more people on mass transit, we can get more cars off the road, and that means we have less combustion byproducts, less greenhouse gas emissions, less co-pollutants. So again, whose neighborhoods primarily host these highways and byways, right? Black communities, brown communities. There's money in here for roads, bridges, and major projects, 110 billion. The 66 billion in for passenger and freight rail, which is good, I think. Uh, the broadband, I think this is a repeat slide, and the broadband is really important because a lot of rural communities and also some urban communities don't have good broadband access. There's money in here for ports, airports, and I mean a lot of the airport stuff. You got a lot of pollution associated with those activities, so I think it's good in some ways, but I'm biased. So I would say I would rather invest in green ports, which is a thing that we're trying to get these ports to become more green and electrify all their vehicles, so they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions too. Water infrastructure is money for water. Think about Flint again, y'all. Think about our tribal communities, our tribal brothers and sisters who don't have access to sewer and water infrastructure. Our power grid, trying to again move to clean energy. Resiliency, because of climate change, a lot of our infrastructure, right, gets impacted. You see floods, you see wildfires. So this resiliency dollars are really important. And actually, those dollars are too low, in my opinion. Clean school buses and ferries. Remember I said before that when you burn diesel on a bus, your kids on that bus, they're basically on a moving smokestack. So if we can electrify those buses, that means the kids will no longer be exposed to those VOCs and the black carbon in particular matter that impacts their short-term coordination, concentration, focus, right? And also can cause asthma, and long-term can cause cancer. Charging stations. If we're going to make sure we get to this clean energy economy, we have to make sure there has to be equity and opportunity. And equity and opportunity and access to electric vehicles, and equity and opportunity and access to charging stations. Charging stations have to be in everybody's communities, not just a few folks' communities, okay? And then dealing with legacy pollution. Some of you may know about brownfields. You got old gas stations, old industrial facilities that just sit there, you create squalor, that create blight, right? Cleaning those facilities up and making that land something you can use again. Think about the vacant lot program, for example, in Baltimore. So these are things in the infrastructure bill that I think you should be advocating for, at the local level, to say we want to make sure these dollars are coming in. I believe some of the churches may have a community development corporation associated with them. There's a whole green to church movement that's interfaith power and light. You should be engaging with those entities to make sure you're talking to the policymakers to make sure that at the county council level, at the municipality level, talk to your town mayors, your state representatives, that these dollars are getting to the communities that you serve, to the parishioners that you serve, to communities that may be vulnerable, may be underserved, okay? So how do we get to climate justice and equity? So there's a climate gap, everyone. As I said, the climate crisis is not affecting us equally. Whether it be a biological disaster like COVID-19, a heat wave, or environmental injustice, it's impacting folks of color first and worse and the most, okay? It's impacting low-income folks first and worse and the most. So we have to make sure that, the folks who are in leadership understand that. A lot of the green groups who are advocating for, y'all may have heard like carbon sequestration or carbon pricing or cap and trade. Don't worry about those things. You haven't heard of them before. The issue is those types of policies are not beneficial to communities that we serve and we come from, because those policies are policies that actually create hotspots. I already got a hotspot of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in my community. You do cap and trade, basically you allow a facility over here to cap what they do. And they may be in Georgia, but I live in North Carolina, and you trade credits in a community, that facility is still polluting. They don't have to change what they do. They can actually pollute more. So that can lead to more hotspots being produced and more pollution in the hotspots that are already there. And whose communities are the sacrifice zones? Whose communities are disproportionate hotspots? Again, communities of color, folks of color, Black folk. Okay? Or Latinx brothers and sisters, Indigenous brothers and sisters. So we need to have more diversity in the voices who are talking about climate change. That was a report, that survey that came out, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And sometimes you may think about, oh, Black folk ain't interested in climate change. Latino brothers is not interested in climate change. That's not true. The survey for the AP said that I believe 68% or more of the African American folks who were surveyed said they think climate change is an issue. I think many of us are well aware of climate change. All of us talk about climate change, like, oh my God, we have these projections about what's going to happen in 20 years and 50 years. Climate change is impacting our communities right now. We need action right now. We need solutions right now to the heat waves, to the stormwater flooding, to the sewage backups, to not having access to safe drinking water, to the droughts, to the food issues, right? Food apartheid, to living in the floodplain. We need action right now. Our community should be prioritized for dollars and investments. And right now, enough of that is not happening. With the new administration, they're trying, but they have a lot of work to do to rectify, like this injustices that we've experienced. Not just the environmental justice, but the climate injustice. And then the folks who are advocating for that change, we got to make sure that the church, you are at the table. Frontline Finish Line community folks are at the table, okay? So when you think about why that's important, think about it from a worker perspective. You look at COVID-19 again. Folks of color disproportionately in those jobs that people have to kind of go out to, those essential jobs, right? Those essential jobs were low-paying jobs, with jobs that put you at more risk of being exposed to SARS-CoV-2 and put you in a situation of losing your life. Now, we are disproportionately in jobs as outdoor workers, construction workers, agricultural workers, landscape workers. So when you are dealing with climate change and heat issues, you're gonna have an increased risk of exposure to heat, which is a physical stressor, an increased risk of having a heat stroke, right? Going to the hospital and potentially losing your life. So we have to address those issues when it comes to the climate gap. Job productivity is an issue. Because of certain types of jobs that folks are in, you may see a loss of productivity because of natural disasters. The fishing industry gets wiped out, or certain industries get hit over and over again when you have a hurricane, or all the constant forest fires that you have in California. It disrupts tourism. It disrupts outdoor-based work. So we got to think about that. There's cities across the country like Chicago, Portland, I believe LA, I think DC has a sustainability plan. New York City is doing something around climate change. In the state of Maryland, Baltimore has its own climate action plan. So you should be advocating for your city to have a climate action plan. How are you going to address climate change? In Baltimore, they have what they call resilience hubs. So when the power goes out, they have backup power in locations. When the power goes out and people need water, they can go get water. When power goes out, if your aunt is on the dialysis, there's a place to get electricity so they can make sure she can, continue her dialysis working. Resilience hubs. We need to have that in every city. So the average annual temperature in Maryland has risen by over 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the start of the 20th century. So that means, again, you're gonna see more rain events, more precipitation, sea level issues, right? By 2100, range of 1 to 4 feet. Annapolis is gonna be gone, y'all. It's gonna be underwater. For those of you who've been in Norfolk recently, what you said that Norfolk is gonna be underwater. A lot of these places where they're on the coast near the water, because of sea level rise, they're gonna disappear. Talk about Baltimore's heat island. Again, I talked about when you have, and this you see the figure, when you have a warm roof, asphalt, it's going to only reflect about 20% of the heat. When you have a cool roof, it reflects 80% of the heat. So your building materials have a big driver of whether or not they absorb heat or they reflect heat. But in Baltimore, a lot of the building materials are black tar. So you can see a big difference in temperature, 9 degrees. East and West Baltimore can be 50 degrees hotter than the more affluent areas. Think about it. So say if it's 85 degrees outside, in East and West Baltimore, it could be 100 degrees at the neighborhood level. So we got to bring in green roofs and green walls and cool roofs to reflect that sunlight. There was a report that was done a few years ago by students at the University of Maryland called Baltimore Code Red, talking about the climate divide. And they put up sensors to basically at the household level at row houses to basically measure and map temperature, okay? To look at humidity. And what they found was, you know, a big difference, and I'll get to that, a big issue between temperature differences from block to block. There's some work that's been done in Louisville, Kentucky, using the same approach. And you see, you got to have trees. So a report came out last year called the Nature Gap. It said that African Americans have 3 times less access to nature compared to their white counterparts, and low-income folks have 3 times less access to nature compared to their wealthier counterparts. What does that mean again? Trees, the ecological goods and services that we get from trees, from green space, from parks, from rivers and streams. But getting back to trees, I said it earlier, I said again, trees are good for heat mitigation, temperature mitigation, noise mitigation, stormwater management. Trees are good for playability, mental health. You can grow food with certain kinds of trees, right? No, on the trees, right? Fruit trees. We should have food forests in our communities. Green the church. Think about the land that you have. Do you have trees on that land? That could be a ecotopia for your parishioners. To do gardening, have a place to, your church could be a resilience hub. So when there's a power outage, because there will be another power outage, you have backup power, cooling. The church can be a hub for these things. That's an opportunity to think about the least of these, right? To protect the most vulnerable. Trees are important. Again, they provide services. Think about that. So when you look at in Baltimore, you know, one of the single greatest threats, as the CEO of American Forest says, one of the single greatest threats from climate change in cities is extreme heat. So look at the photo. I'm not sure if you can see it well, but you see to the right side where the red car is. So you see a temperature reading of 163.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Move to where the tree is. You know, this is the surface of the road. It's 97 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Now move to the left as you move out of the shadow of the tree. The surface temperature is 117.6. So just a few feet away, because that sensor was right in the shaded area of the tree, you see almost a 20-degree difference. So it's just not it's not just a difference between block to block. It's row house to row house. The benefit of having a tree. The benefit of having a tree could be, you know, the difference between life and death, particularly if you don't have air conditioning, particularly if you are immobile and older. Just want to, you know, leave you with that point. So if you look at, you know, temperature, you can see a relationship between high temperature in Baltimore and a relationship with health conditions. So the heat wave in 2019, you saw increased calls for dehydration, respiratory distress, kidney disease, diabetes complications, and heart attacks and heart failures. So some folks already have underlying health issues, right? But then exposure to heat created stress, which put them in health distress. We have to address this and these type of issues because, again, remember the historic policies, redlining, FHA, the National Highway Defense Act, segregation, right? It's setting our communities up for failure because we had no trees, we had too much concrete and asphalt, we had poor housing quality, poor housing stock, and this putting people at risk from climate change. So you see associations between, again, heat and income. Look at this map again. You go from cooler to hotter. So the areas that are cooler, you can see that the income levels in the right-hand map are higher, right? So this is saying that what you live matters, context matters, place matters. It also means that economic policies impact health. That it also shows that income inequality impacts health. Economic inequality impacts health. Economic inequality is leading to folks being exposed to more climate change impacts particularly extreme heat. So to address the extreme heat issue and the differential impact of climate change, we got to address income inequality. Go back to Justice 40. We got to invest in our communities. We got to invest in good infrastructure. We got to invest in healthy economic opportunity structures as well. Flooding issues. Hurricane Sandy. We had 84.3 million gallons of sewage that overflowed in Maryland due to Hurricane Sandy. 81,000 people in Maryland at risk from coastal flooding. Maryland's Eastern Shore. Scientists predict that by 2040, rainwaters will produce 1.5 inches more over a 24-hour period. That means you're going to see more of these flash flood events. You're going to see more downpours, more deeper floodwaters. And again, because we have so many highways and byways and so many impervious surfaces, when it rains, where does the water go? We don't have the natural sponges to absorb that water. So church, green the church. We got to invest in green infrastructure, greenways. We got to move to more mass transit. Rely less on cars. Rely more on building pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods and communities, which many of us don't have access to. So the grocery store is close to the house. So instead of having to take the metro and go to the kiss and ride, you're on the kiss and ride lot, because you have to drive to get to the kiss and ride lot, right? Instead of having to drive to get to the kiss and ride lot, I have to get on the train. Maybe make sure the jobs are near my house. Maybe make sure the school is near my house. Maybe make sure the grocery store is near my house. I need to have some parks near my house. I go exercise and get some green space and breathe some clean air and get some shade and cooling. We got to transform and change how we build our communities. Again, we got to focus on building ecotopias. Y'all remember Ellicott City had two major flood events. I think they had the second one was the week of or the week after they had the grand reopening of the city. And it's in a bowl, right? So if you're gonna address the flooding in Ellicott City, you got to address it on the front end, up top where the rivers and streams are, to find ways to mitigate that. Okay. So what can you do? Develop climate action plans. Ask for a climate. Does your town have a climate action plan? Does your neighborhood have a climate action plan? Does your church have a climate action plan? Well, Dr. Wilson, I don't know. Okay, find out. Maybe y'all should start a climate ministry. You may have a health ministry. You may have a social justice ministry. You may want to have a climate and health ministry. And then work with your community development corporation that's affiliated with the church or local CDCs. Work with your town mayor, your town council, and say, we want to be able to get stormwater dollars, right, Elder Calhoun? Stormwater dollars. So we put in best management practice. We want to put in green infrastructure at our church, in the neighborhoods there, in the parishioners where our parishioners live, right? We want to be able to create workforce opportunities. The climate change, you got all this doom and gloom, right? Oh, woe is me, the world's going to end. We got folks already dealing with death and destruction every day in the communities that are dealing with environmental justice, climate injustice. That doom and gloom is not going to work. How can we talk about a climate economy and climate opportunity, workforce development? How can we build, grow, have an economy that's justice focused, community centered, and restorative, rejuvenative? I can't even say the word right. Trying to preach a little bit. I'm going to leave that to y'all to preach. But an economy that's restorative, that's equity focused, and that's green. That's what y'all should be advocating for. That's what you should be pushing for. But again, there are dollars from the infrastructure bill that you should be advocating to get into your communities. And then the Build Back Better bill, there will be additional dollars to look to. So create your own climate action plan. And then be part of these social movements. Be part of the environmental justice movement. Be part of the climate justice movement. We do have the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Economic Justice Coalition. Empower DC is a part of it in DC. Waikiria Pool and Central Emporia Familiar and Clean Water Action, part of it in Maryland. You got the Virginia Egypt Collaborative, part of it for Virginia. Wherever you are, try to connect to this coalition. If you don't connect to this coalition, check out the NAACP. They have climate environmental justice coordinators in many of the chapters in the region. Think about other groups that you can join. Join the Sierra Club and push them to have more of a DEI, social justice, environmental justice focus. Join these groups. Be a part of the movement. You have the National Climate Justice Alliance. You have the National Black Environmental Justice Network. You have other groups out there that you can join and be a part of, who are fighting for justice, who are fighting for communities that be more climate resilient, and who are pushing for equity, and understand that we got to address racism and structural poverty, and we're going to make sure we can deal with issues of mitigation and adaptation around climate change. So we got to have climate justice. We got to have climate justice. And I'll just end with this last quote from Dr. King. What it really boils down to is this: that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. That's what climate change is about. And for us to address climate change, we have to have solidarity. We have to, understand our connection to our faith and to God, and our connection to this planet. And we have to focus on our faith and love and our shared humanity. So I will close with that. Thank you.
Questions?
Hope that did I end too early? Y'all are welcome.
And the impact and the challenges we face with climate change. I encourage you to reach out and find more information, whether it's not on YouTube or books, but it's not going to go away. And as Dr. Wilson pointed out, it will affect us and our communities the worst. So thank you for participating in this, and watching and observing this information. And the call to action is where we are now. Let's talk about what we can do to mitigate this. In a few moments, we're going to be blessed with a plenary session talking about, as I said earlier, one of the main issues that affected the transition of Virginia from a blue to a red state, critical race theory. Dr. Hendricks is going to explain it to us and break it down. It essentially was an academic concept talking about how racism was not just a feeling or response to minorities and Black people based on white supremacy or the like, but critical race theory purports that racism is a part of the fabric of America. It's instituted in the policies of America. Redlining was a part of critical race impact, where it wasn't just a practice, don't move into my neighborhood, but redlining became a practice, that became a policy. The same thing with the way they treated veterans when they came back from wars overseas, the same way they treated farmers when it came to divvying out money from the USDA. There have been policies, the Reconstruction era, the way that our federal government allowed the former plantation owners to have their free reign with the former slaves. Our country has, from its very inception, the way it treated Indians and broke all the treaties. Critical race theory, from an academic perspective, basically says that racism is more than a feeling or response to other people, that it is a part of the fabric of our nation. And unfortunately, there are communities that no longer want to allow what America's story is, the real story of America, to be taught. But they want to whitewash it, they want to water it down, they want to make it such, in some states, where it's even against the law to read certain books that we've taken for granted, to say certain words. Their issue is they don't want anything taught that will make their children uncomfortable, or to make them to feel responsible for many of the things that have happened to African Americans in this country. So he's going to give us a very insightful overview, and we're excited about it. He's going to be here in a short time, but let's take a brief break and we'll be right back. God bless.
Praise Him, praise Him, Jesus, blessed Savior, He's worthy to be praised. Praise
Praise the Lord, everybody. We pray that you had a wonderful time just to stretch and to refresh yourself. I've got a special treat for you before Dr. Aubrey Hendricks comes. There is a gifted brother who has been involved in fundraising in a major way over the last 20 years. I'm talking about raising $120 million in grant funds to do a transportation project, raising $900 million to do affordable housing nationwide, setting up a venture capital fund that provided funds for new businesses, $3 million, dealing with environmental protection. This brother has pastored and served as a president of several nonprofit corporations. He hails from St. Louis. He served in a pastoring position in one of the leading churches in our country, First AME Church in LA, and became the pastor of a church starting with 4 members, Christ our Redeemer, that grew to over 4,000 members. I think you know who he is. He's the Reverend Dr. Mark Whitlock, Reverend Hermia's husband. He's coming now to talk about how did you get started. He'll be available to churches that want to get more involved and talk about it in a more detailed basis. But for the next 10 minutes, he just wants to talk to us, have a conversation about how do I get started as a church nonprofit to begin raising funds that are outside of the offering plate. Here comes the Reverend Dr. Mark Whitlock.
President, thank you so much. I have been involved with the AME Church for well over 35 years and as a pastor for almost 25 years. And I have been a lead church for a while, and I have hosted district conferences, but I have never had an opportunity to attend a district conference like this. I mean, you have brought together legends like the Bryants last year, but this year, it was absolutely marvelous to watch the Watley father and son preaching moment, and then Aubrey Hendricks out of Columbia University, and then have both of the Watleys make presentations on how to handle a virtual church and evangelism in a COVID environment. And then our EPA man, environmental protection, dealing with global warming and the greening of our country was just outstanding. So I don't know if you're on the chat, just come on, right in the chat, well done for our presiding elder. I know Bishop James LeVert Davis is very proud of you, has to be, because you are cutting edge in teaching pastors to look beyond themselves and look beyond the pulpit in order to create new paradigms that bring about not only social justice, ecological justice, but also creation of new ministry. I'm honored to have an opportunity to share just briefly about the business of fundraising, or better yet, the benefit of creating alternative revenue streams for the local church. And I think that's important, that we look at what Watley said, how do we improve the value proposition for a church? How do we indeed meet the needs of communities, not only those who are hurting, left out, left behind, hungry, homeless, and naked, but how do you take care of those who are serving those people? What Dr. Watley said, what Reverend Dr. Matthew Watley said was, the people who were providing service to the people in the community are the people that joined his church, because they had a similar value proposition of the ministry that they were doing. And I have to say that the lessons learned from Reverend Dr. Cecil Chip Murray at First AME Church, who takes a church of 300 members to 18,000 members over 27 years. And he's my father in the ministry. And he would say that we have to be first to serve beyond the walls of the church. If we're not meeting the needs of the community, if we're not clothing the naked, housing the homeless, taking care of the hungry, then we're not doing the authentic ministry of Jesus Christ. So it's not just a Sunday service, but it really is a Sunday through Saturday service. We come to worship, but we leave to work. I will never forget how he asked me when I was a banker. I was a banker and doing deals that started out at about $50 million. And my largest deal as a banker was about $650 million. And that was over 30 years ago. And he said, I know you put money in people's pocket who already have money, but could you put some money in people's pocket who have no money? Can you raise us $50,000? And I looked at him and thought, man, I ain't never been asked to raise money for my people. I've always provided money for people who didn't really need the money. And so once touched by that and realized that I had, my values were for people who didn't really need the help, and my people who needed help, my people who were crying for help in Los Angeles, who were hungry for help in Los Angeles, strung out on drugs, and mothers trying to maintain a house with little to no money. It touched my soul, it touched my heart. And so we started coming together and bringing men and women together who worked in the public sector, worked in government, who worked in private industry, who worked in the community. And we sat down and we started talking about how we can meet the needs of the community. I would like to say that that I had a bunch of education. No, I got my education after I got to calling. I didn't have any education. I didn't have a BA, didn't have anything some 30 years ago. After I got the calling, that's when I said I need to go back to school and learn how to read and write. I need to go back to school to learn how to write a proposal. And did that, and didn't have to go out and hire any proposal writers, didn't have to go out and beg people, because the benefit of having people in our congregation, particularly here in the DMV, is that we have people seated, members, board members who know and have connection to people who can help you to bring alternative revenue streams into your church. And it doesn't take a rocket science. It doesn't take a Mark Whitlock. It doesn't take somebody walking the halls of Congress, because we have people, men and women, who are sitting in the pew. One of the things that I love about Dr. Lee P. Washington, the people that made this church called Reed Temple, the people that created a project called the Woodlands apartment building, 256 units, multi-million-dollar project. They are members of this church. They didn't have to go out and get a consultant. They didn't have to go out and get somebody that they got to pay $200,000 to raise $20,000 or to raise a failure. They had them right. So I'm saying the first thing is you have people right in your church who can help you. Number two, we have to find a way to discover what are the needs of our community. Some communities need housing. Some community need medical treatment. Some of the communities need business loans or business support. Some communities need help by way of education. So how do we take a survey? How do we help people in the community? First, you do a survey, find out what are the felt needs, what are the problems in the community. One of the things that Matthew Watley said is that he said we needed to provide food for people in Prince George's as well as the areas in some schools. And he had a contract with PG's public schools to provide food for people in various areas. What happened was, in public dollars, those dollars are spent in public entities, and they need somebody to operate that program. So what he did was he simply was the operator, but the challenge existed, and the government put money to meet the challenge. So I would assume that they were paid a fee or certainly a grant to feed people. Here's the message. How do we sit down with Also Brooks? How may we sit down with our county execs or certainly their staff to determine how your church where you're located can help meet the needs of the people within the community where you live, work, and worship, the constituency where you are. So we don't have to recreate the wheel. We don't have to have rocket science mentality. What we have to do is find out from our elected officials, find out from those people who have access to resources, money, programs, dollars, what help may I provide? Is there a way you can cover some costs, some expenses, so that we may do the work of God, to provide services to the community? Do you know, right after, in 1992, we were having challenges in Los Angeles. People couldn't get from point A to point B. People couldn't get to work. People couldn't get to the medical field. So we found out that there was a program in New York City called Scripts, coupons that would move you from point A to B, covered by the local city. They paid into transportation agencies scripts that would take care of poor people who needed to get to the doctor, who needed to get to work, who needed to get to school, and they would give them $28 worth of scripts a week for transportation for free. So we wrote a grant, we wrote a proposal, we submitted it to the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and we said we need $5 million, and 20% of the $5 million, 20% of $5 million is $1 million. We need $5 million to go to community residents who need transportation, our seniors, our sick, our unemployed. Give them scripts or a coupon, and that way they can use that coupon to either get a bus token or a taxi ride to where they have to go. And we want it funded annually for $5 million. Of that $5 million, we need 20%, here's your million, 20% for operating costs. They said, no problem, because that's how it works. And they said, we know it works because that's how they do it in New York. We'll do it here in Los Angeles. And we said our nonprofit would operate the program. How many people can you move for $4 million with that taxi coupon program and bus token? We said that we can move over 1 million people a year. And we can do that through various agencies in the city of Los Angeles. They said, fine, write your proposal. We wrote the proposal, took it to the Board of Supervisors, took it to MTA. The Board of Supervisors get together and says, yes, we will fund this program for $5 million. And of that $5 million, you will get 20% to operate the program. That means $1 million a year to operate the program for operational costs, and $4 million to provide services to the city of Los Angeles. That program started in 1992. You multiply 1990, you multiply $5 million a year from 1992, you'll come up with about $124 million because we got funded every year. Wow. Same thing worked with a housing developer. The housing developer had raised $1 billion, African-American man. He's now working with us here at Reed Temple. How may we develop housing in this, now I'm talking about at Christ Our Redeemer. How may we develop housing, low to income housing? How may we develop housing to meet the needs of seniors, to meet the needs of the poor, to meet the needs of those who are going through challenges, even market rate housing? How can we do it? And we don't want to limit it to LA. We want to do it in Orange County, California. We want to do it in Long Beach, California. We want to do it in Upper Marlboro because we own 2 pieces of property here from Christ Our Redeemer in Upper Marlboro, California. Maryland. How do we do it in Washington? How do we do it in Seattle, Washington, where we own? How do we do it in Oakland, California? Well, we were able, one, to decide where were the challenges in the community. Remember, you got to decide where the challenges are. Number two, those companies, those banks, those industries who will make investments into those communities, those bankers. So we raised $1 billion. And of that $1 billion, we were able to use $900 million in partnership with Advantage Realty to go out and develop housing for people who are in need, and some 13 housing projects. Well, what does that take? I'm glad you asked the question, President. You got to have a thorough knowledge of the housing industry. You just don't go in with a bag. You go in with facts and figures. You go in with knowledge about the housing community. You go in with knowledge about real estate. And so with that knowledge, then the banker, then the investors feel comfortable Amen. Making an investment into your business. What was lovely about Sears Roebuck, they were first a catalog business. I remember I used to look at the Sears catalog. I'm not going to tell you all the pictures I used to look at, but that's another story. You would look at Sears catalog. I used to love their peanuts and jelly beans at Sears. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to tell my sins. And then they became a real estate company because they had a bunch of retail stores. And in their real estate company, they eventually lose money because retail begins to go down. But if they had stayed an Amazon type of company, they would have done very well. Here's my point. What Watley said was, are we a Sears model or are we an Amazon model? I believe we can be both. The Amazon model says, how do we become innovative? How do we come out of ourselves to the greater self of God? I believe Paul was right. Be ye not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. We need to renew our minds as pastors, as stewards, as trustees, as members, to say, yes, the tithe is good. Yes, the plate is good. But there's also plates outside of the church. There's plates in government. There's plates in the banking industries. There's plates in healthcare. There's plates available for us to build the kingdom of God. We are available to help. We are available to meet with you. I'm going to give you the number at Reed Temple. If you have an interest in creating alternative revenue streams or just how to get your business started in the business of nonprofit economic development, housing others, please give us a call and we're here to serve you. Thank you, President.
Thank you, my brother. We appreciate your experience and the willingness to share, to enable us, to empower us, to assist us in creating alternative sources of revenues to help not only fund the operations of our church, but also to help us extend and expand our ministry outreach. Well, I'm honored today to be able to introduce to many of us and present to all of us the Reverend Dr. Aubrey M. Hendricks, Jr. Dr. Hendricks is a lifelong social activist. He's one of the foremost commentators on the intersection between religion and political economy in America. He's one of the most widely read, perhaps most influential African-American biblical scholars today. He, in his recent book, talking about Christians against Christianity, how the right-wing evangelicals are destroying our nation and our faith, gathered to provide us an insight into what Christianity is not and what a false sense of Christianity can do to affect, to hurt, to undermine our country. Dr. Hendricks is a sought-after lecturer, media spokesman. He's been on all of the media stations, CNN, MSNBC, NBC, CBS, Fox, Bloomberg, and the like. We're thankful today that he's coming here. He's very prepared. He's matriculated at some of the most outstanding Ivy League organizations, higher university, higher institutions of higher learning in our country. And so without further ado, let me present to you the Reverend Dr. Aubrey M. Hendricks, Jr. Hear ye him.
Thank you, Elder.
God bless you.
So much for that introduction, and thank you for your invitation to entrust to me discussion of this very, very important subject. It's it reflects your forward-looking vision.
Praise God.
For African Methodism, and I'm very thankful for it. I'd also like to thank my brother and friend of decades, too many decades for us to mention, Reverend Dr. Mark Whitlock. I'm so glad to spend time with, and thank you so much and your staff for your hospitality. And I'm also glad to be in this great house, Reed Temple, a great institution, great reflection of what African Methodism is and what it can continue to be. I I'd like to begin to, let me also say this. I'm so glad to see my friend, Reverend Roger Reed, hadn't seen for years, still kicking. I mean that literally. I ain't saying when he's kicking, but if you all know him, you know he's kicking something. Glad to see you, though, brother, my brother. I want to begin with a little story. And this is not one of them interminable Baptist stories, though I was raised Baptist, but this is an AME story, which means it's going to be concise and to the point, but seriously. There was once a young man who was very serious about serving humanity. He made it his life's work to raise consciousness and to try to make a difference in society for all people. But as it turned out, the reality of it was that he was also an atheist. And the way that he tried to serve humanity was to turn people away from what he thought was the most pernicious and destructive belief of humankind. And to him, that was belief in God. He was wrong, but he was sincerely wrong. He sincerely believed this. So every Sunday at the 11 o'clock hour, he would go up into the mountains and he'd walk through the forest, and he'd look up at the sky with his hands behind his back, and he'd look up at the clouds, and he'd think of new and more effective ways to try to turn people away from the worship of God. He did this very sincerely, wrongly, but very sincerely. And one particular Sunday, as he walked through the woods and the mountains with his hands behind his back and his head turned up to the clouds, ruminating on new and more effective ways to turn people away from God, he tripped over over a root, an upturned root, and he hit the ground very hard. He lay there stunned for a moment, and when he regained his senses, he realized he was not hurt, and so he pushed to stand up, but he also realized, though, that his foot was caught in this upturned root. And so as he struggled to get out, unworried, and unhurried, he struggled to get out. He heard a sound in the woods, a far-off sound, and he noted it, but it didn't bother him. But as he struggled to get loose, the sound started getting louder and louder, a crashing sound coming through the woods. So he continued trying to extricate himself, but the sound started getting louder and louder coming toward him. He started getting alarmed, and so he started struggling harder and harder to get out, and the sounds coming to him harder and harder and closer and louder, and he's struggling to get out, and then he looks up and he realizes what's making the sound is this angry bear coming at him, fangs bared and claws bared, coming at him full speed. So the young man is struggling to get out, and the bear's coming at him, fangs bared, claws bared, and the young man's struggling. And finally, the bear's upon him. The young man looks up and sees me, said, "Oh, God, help me!" And time stood still. And a voice came out of the heavens and said, there you go. You're calling on me now. After all you've done to turn people away from me, which caused immeasurable harm and confusion, even death. And now you're calling on me. Do you think you have the right to do that? The young man just hung his head. He said, well, I'm a merciful God. You've called on me. I will cleave to your call. The young man said, but no, I have to be a man of integrity. And, I've talked so badly about you and turned so many people against you that I can't ask you to do anything for me, really with integrity. So I'm just going to ask you if you will just please make this bear a Christian. So then we're back in real time. And the bear's coming down upon him with fangs bared, claws bared. He's coming upon him and he says, oh, we thank you, Heavenly Father, for this food we're about to receive. And if there is a conclusion that we can draw from this little parable, it is that misunderstandings and misapplications of knowledge can be fatal. But I hasten to say that this conclusion does not apply to our subject today, critical race theory, because critical race theory is not innocently misunderstood. And so it really should not be, misunderstanding should not be forgiven, in my opinion. Critical race theory is purposely attacked and maliciously misportrayed in the public realm as a way to discredit all of our efforts to expose and oppose racism in all its various guises. In fact, the forces of racism and toxic reaction would have us believe that critical race theory is destructive and antithetical to everything that is decent and American. Rather than opposing and exposing racism in American society and its body politic, the opponents of critical race theory claim instead that it is a racist attack on all white people, a racist attack by Black people on all white people. That takes some nerve, doesn't it? They claim that it teaches that all whites are instinctive racists, that it teaches white children to be ashamed of their whiteness, that it is too upsetting to white children to learn what their forebears have done, and that it falsely claims the existence of white skin color privilege, and that critical race theory and all of these things that they claim are being taught to children, grade school children as young as kindergarten. That's their claim. And this has led to violent protesters showing up at school board meetings, threatening and assaulting school board members and wielding signs saying things like, "Stop teaching critical racist theory to our kids," or "I am not an oppressor," and nonsensical things like that. But what is critical race theory? Well, critical race theory really is a graduate school level legal theory that says that any analysis of American society must take into account America's history of racism and the role that race plays and has played in shaping legislation, policies, social attitudes, and political institutions. In a nutshell, critical race theory looks at the ways racism influences policies, procedures, and institutions in such ways as to perpetuate racial inequality, even when those who are involved in making decisions evince no personal racism. In other words, critical race theory says that racism is systemic, that it is deeply embedded in America's political, social, and economic ecosystems and infrastructures. Richard Delgado, one of the founders of critical race theory, put it this way. He said that racism is the ordinary, normal, usual way American society does business, that it is the common, everyday experience of most people of color in this country. And so the claims of critical race theory include the following. First, that racism is and has always been, as Delgado says, has always been normal in American society, going back even before the nation's founding, and that it is codified in the nation's Constitution, in the 3/5 clause, in the Fugitive Slave Clause, and in the Indentured Servitude Clause in the 14th Amendment, which allowed convict servitude, which is simply slavery by another name. It also claims that white America has only sought racial justice when it serves the interests of whites for economic or propagandistic reasons, or for other reasons of political calculation, such as when affirmative action became much more widely accepted and far less embattled only after Lyndon Johnson amended his executive order to make white women the major beneficiaries of affirmative action. It claims as well that race is a social construction, not a biological fact, but that it is a racial construction crafted to identify those who are to be socially and politically ascendant and those who are to be politically and socially subjugated. That is to say that the purpose of the concept of race in America is to construct a social and political hierarchy based on skin color, with whites at the top and people of color at the bottom. And critical race theory claims as well that we must examine society intersectionally, which means that to come to any clear and authentic understanding of society, we have to examine how race and gender and class and national origin and sexual orientation all come together to influence the construction of laws and attitudes that serve to determine access to the good things of life. The good things like healthcare and personal security and freedom of mobility without fear, justice in the courts, and so on. In essence, then, the purpose of critical race theory is to present a counter-narrative to the ways that America falsely portrays its shameful historical treatment of people of color by telling the truths of how we Black people and other people of color have experienced America. To paraphrase the old African proverb, until lions have their own historians and political commentators, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So let me share with you an obvious example of what critical race theory does. And this can be seen, for example, in its correction of the way the vast wealth gap between Blacks and whites have been portrayed in the prevailing American narrative. Because you see, as we know, the typical white US household has 7 times the amount of wealth of the average Black household. But this gap is often portrayed in the media as a result of bad choices by Black folks, like living for the moment rather than thinking strategically, or by a less industrious attitude on the part of Blacks, which is strange to me because nobody has worked harder than Black folks in America. Or they blame it on faulty family structures, or that Blacks have a pathological culture with a victim mentality that only looks for handouts and not opportunities, and so forth. But critical race theory reveals that the gap can be traced back to factors such as the US government's practice of redlining Black neighborhoods as inherently poor credit risks and denying mortgages to residents of those neighborhoods for decades, thus denying Blacks the biggest source of wealth accumulation for the middle class, which is home ownership. And not to mention that this wealth gap also caused by the years that Blacks were denied home ownership grants under the GI Bill, which they don't talk about, or despite having, or the centuries of unpaid or poorly paid wages that Black folks have had to endure. We forget that for the majority of the existence of the United States of America, capital formation by Black folks was illegal under the law. These are things that critical race theory will raise and to help analyze and really understand where the fault lies for so many of the terrible tribulations that we have had to and continue to endure. So where did critical race theory come from? Well, although it originated in 1989, really as a form of legal analysis by Richard Delgado and my colleague at Columbia, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others. The origins of critical race theory really stretch back decades to earlier writings by Black legal scholars, including the well-known essay titled Brown versus Board of Education and the Interest Convergence Dilemma, which is a 1980 essay by the late Harvard law professor Derek Bell, one of the fathers of critical race theory. Noting that the Supreme Court's 1954 ruling ending school segregation had not succeeded in creating equal educational opportunities, Bell concluded that outlawing this discrimination is not the same as ensuring true equality. He also argued that racial progress in the US has occurred only when it aligned with white interests. For instance, he noted that the nation only emancipated slaves when it was clear that it had to be done to restore the Union, and that school desegregation happened coincidentally happened because Soviet Union propaganda was discrediting America around the world by regularly publicizing images of violence against Black Americans as proof that American citizens weren't actually free. So to counter that, the government had to move to at least give the impression of justice by finally moving to support school segregation, school desegregation. That goes back a couple decades, but until recently then, critical race theory was really only primarily found in scholarly legal and pedagogical journals as a method for examining the structural elements behind racial disparities in a number of areas of American life, such as examining the causes and sources of racial disparities in school performance, in disparities in the justice system that systematically imposes greater punishments on Blacks than whites for the very same crimes, and seeking to change public school curricula that ignore the history and points of view of Black Americans. So that's how it was known for decades. But how did an obscure theory like this, which was only taught in scholarly circles for decades, suddenly become the enemy of all things good in America, as they claim? How did that happen? Well, the first time, the precepts of critical race theory were brought to mainstream attention, although because of the concepts it embodied and not known by his name. This occurred in 1993 when President Bill Clinton nominated, as we might recall, Lonnie Guinier, who was then a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He nominated her to lead the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. And as many will recall, Clinton ended up withdrawing her nomination. I think it was a cowardly move, but it would not be his last cowardly move, in my political opinion. But he was forced to withdraw her nomination when the political opposition raised and focused on some of her legal writings that utilized basic concepts of critical race theory without using the term. And this especially included her proposals for changing how elections and legislators should work to guarantee that the interests of people of color were not overlooked. But after Clinton withdrew her nomination, the furor died down and nobody really much paid attention to the concepts that she had offered. But this changed really only a year ago, after critical race theory had been in existence for decades. Only a year ago, the angry, violent backlash against critical race theory began in July 2020, when Christopher Rufo, a 30-something conservative activist, published a series of articles that portrayed critical race theory, which he had come upon in some footnotes in some books he had been using to attack the issues that were being raised in the after George Floyd's murder. When he published these series of articles, he portrayed critical race theory as what he called, in his words, the perfect villain to spark white outrage and energize a strategic campaign for racist and right-wing cultural warriors to push back against the rising tide of awareness of racial injustice that was being wrought by the videotaped police murder of George Floyd. Rufo wrote on Twitter that his goal was to turn critical race theory, in his term, toxic, he said, in order to attack, indict, and discredit a broad range of progressive and anti-racism efforts, and to brand them as racist, anti-white, and anti-American. He strategically set out to do that. And Rufo's claims resulted in frequent invitations to appear on the Fox News Network show of the unapologetically racist, in my opinion, morally degenerate Tucker Carlson, who hosts the highest rated program in cable television, unbelievably, which I believe says something real about America's racist attitudes, but that's a whole nother discussion. But on the air, and with Carlson's enthusiastic support, Rufo called critical race theory, quote, an existential threat to the United States, like he's talking about the nuclear bomb or something.
Wow.
And then he asked then President Donald Trump, America's favorite sociopath and pathological liar, to issue an executive order abolishing all critical race theory training and related training in the federal government. Although nowhere in the government was critical race theory being taught.
Mama.
3 days later, Trump attacked critical race theory by name. The president of the United States attacked an obscure academic theory by name and instructed federal agencies to end all racial sensitivity training that involved discussions of critical race theory, white privilege, or what Trump called divisive anti-American propaganda. He should know there's never been a more divisive anti-American propagandist than the sociopathic liar Trump. And then Trump also issued an executive order that limited how contractors that provide federal diversity seminars could talk about race. In other words, he effectively outlawed by executive order the discussion of race and racism in the American government. And then Rufo, so let me say that again. So then Rufo and then Trump jump-started the lie that an obscure theory of legal and political analysis is pervading America and poisoning the minds of American youth. And this has resulted in protests and even legislation aimed at critical race theory, as if it is an existential threat to the very existence of the American Republic. They have made critical race theory in the public mind a catch-all concept for any discussion about racism and the wages of racism that is held anywhere, from kindergarten to senior citizens' homes. This is a lie of the greatest magnitude. They have made any discussion of any aspect of racial inequality, no matter how unthreatening the observation might be, they've made it a threat of the greatest magnitude to America, and thus it is a lie of the greatest magnitude, other than perhaps Trump's lie that he's still president of the United States, or that he is a normal human being. Had to throw that in. So what has the fight over critical race theory led to? Well, critical race theory, it's only been taught in a relatively small number of graduate or law schools, yet its opponents lie that it is critical race theory really is indoctrinating K through 12 students. They claim that a graduate school legal theory that graduate students and legal students, law students, have to struggle with, that is actually being taught in kindergarten and in grammar school. And this, is so ridiculous that it's an easily discredited lie, but nonetheless, like so many racist lies in America, it has been a very successful lie. Because at least 28 states have tried to introduce bills or other policies that would restrict states from asking students to engage with race or gender in the classroom in any way. And of course, the purpose of this is to remove any discussion. Well, they claim to remove critical race theory from the classroom, from all education. Well, critical education does not pervade education. What they really want to do is use critical race theory, their attacks on critical race theory as a way to keep Americans from talking about racism and what white racism has done in any way. In Arizona, they passed a law that says that any instruction that, quote, presents any form of blame or judgment on the basis of race is illegal. What are they saying? We don't want to be held accountable in any way for what we have done. But that's not really the whole point. The point is we can't go forward as a nation toward justice if we don't face injustice squarely in the face. But if they don't want to face injustice squarely in the face, what does that say? They don't want justice. They want, as Richard Pryor said, just us when it comes to having the good things of life. This debate about whether and how to discuss race in the classroom has then we've seen it spill into these school board meetings all across the country. Pitting parents against school boards and administrations who are saying that their children are being taught to hate themselves because they're white. And these debates are driving school administrators actually to resign in fear for their lives. And there are others who are facing recall efforts to get rid of them so people can be put into office who will fight against racial equity being discussed in any way. But I must say, to my mind, this is all a crock of mess. Because for centuries, this nation has taught a version of history that lied about the horrors of slavery, about the intelligence and accomplishments of Black folks, that whitewashed the horrors to which Black folks have been and still are regularly subjected. And America didn't care about what those lies did to the psyches of Black children or what it did to the psyches of white children, because it made white children feel superior. It's important to say that critical race theory isn't about any of that. It's not asking for white folks to apologize for the evil deeds of their ancestors, though they were evil deeds. And if they were people of goodwill, they would acknowledge that they have done wrong. But what critical race theory does seek is to identify the abiding structures of the systems of oppression that white folks' ancestors have built, and the privilege that white folks continue to enjoy as a result of those structures and systems, and the disprivilege that Black folks and people of color continue to suffer. So it seems to me, brothers and sisters, that this whole brouhaha, this lie-filled agenda against critical race theory gives us an opportunity, but also an indictment. It provides an opportunity for us to get more people engaged in anti-racist work, more people engaged in struggling for justice, more people in our churches realize that we really, that things have gotten better, but we're in a place where where folk are trying to turn the clock back. This gives us an opportunity to raise consciousness among our people in our pews that they must stand up and struggle harder. The gospel tells us to struggle against injustice, but it also issues an indictment for what we have not done. Critical race theory opponents have issued all kinds of publications. They're on the news all the time. We see right-wing evangelicals are some of the main purveyors of the lies about critical race theory. But we must ask ourselves, where's the Black church? Where are we?
Now you're talking.
We have worldwide denominations with millions of followers, many millions of congregants. We don't hear a peep from at all. What this whole critical race theory lie agenda is telling us, and I believe we have to hear it or we're going to be even in more trouble, is that we have to actively oppose systemic injustice in this country, because if we don't, our children are going to suffer. Our children will be in a country in which racism, like with the right wing, in which racism is not seen as a bad thing. Note that Trump made it chic and cool to be racist again. These folk don't even care. They don't hide it. And it will continue that way until we stand up in the name of the Lord. So, brothers and sisters, I call upon you today to think long and hard about the gospel call to stand up for our neighbors as ourselves, to stand against evil, to stand against systemic evil, to take Luke 4:18 seriously. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor and liberation to the oppressed, because this CRT thing is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just one other way that Trump is coming at us, and his forces of evil are setting the stage to really come upon us harder than ever before. God bless you. Thank you all for your attention, and let's get to work to make this country and this world the bastion of justice that it is supposed to be. In the name of our Lord and Savior, amen.
Wherever you are, let's give the Lord a big hand clap for this wonderful presentation to inform us and to raise our awareness of critical race theory. We want you to chat back at us with questions, comments. We want to be able to engage this wonderful scholar before he leaves. And if you have any questions, please drop them in our chat. We want to also give an opportunity for Reverend Dr. Mark Whitlock to engage our speaker. Let the people of God say amen.
First off, it was an amazing presentation, and I really appreciate the fact that you took time to dissect it and give us the historical background as well as the political challenges that a lot of our advocates are facing, just simply sharing information and sharing truth. As a biblical scholar, I think, and I want to raise the question with you, as a biblical scholar, in the book of Romans chapter 13, it talks about how God has predestined certain political leaders and that believers should support those leaders because they're in office because God so declared it. At least that's the conservative point of view as we look at that text written by Paul to the Roman church in 55 AD. Is that text misconstrued, misinterpreted, misunderstood when it comes to people like Donald Trump and the right-wing Republican advocates that support crushing the truth?
No, that's a very good question, and it's a characteristically brilliant question by my friend Dr. Woodlock. Which thankfully does not stump me. Paul wrote to the church in Rome. The church in Rome was embattled, right? And all of Paul's letters were written to address what the people were experiencing on the ground at the time, right? And what Paul was writing in that letters when he said to respect the authorities that they were put in place by God. Number one was to try to calm the people down from being too anti-authoritarian that would end up in them being, well, they didn't really imprison people unless they were going to kill them. That was going to end up in the community being decimated. I think that though Paul overspoke in some ways, number one, it's hard to imagine that Jesus hanging on the cross in agony would say that God was on the side of the Roman Empire. I think, Paul, as we read his letters, he overspeaks sometimes to make his point, as normal people do. He was a normal person. So what does that mean? What that means is that if we take Paul seriously, then there's no such thing as an unjust social and political order that should be opposed. And we know that's not true. And so we just have to try to understand what he was saying in context. And it really should not be part of our social and political discourse, because he's talking to a religious community trying to calm them down. And he's talking to them in particular. The letter is not to the AME Church or to Christianity in the whole world for 2,000 years. It was a word on target to those people. It was not written to us. It doesn't hold for us. It didn't hold for us when we were enslaved in America, right? So it doesn't hold for us. And so those folk who use that usually are using it to support the status quo because it benefits them, or they don't know any better, which is why there has to be more pastors like yourself and the elder here who are well-schooled and well-educated and serious enough to look at the historical context behind biblical writings. Thank you.
We have more questions. Let me make sure I'm getting them right. I'm not sure who asked the question, but what role does the evangelical church play in fostering the critical race theory? Why are they supporting the big lie?
That's a good question. Well, we have to be specific. We're talking about right-wing evangelicals because there are evangelicals in the AME Church. It's a theological position. Right-wing evangelicals are different because their main allegiance is to their right-wing political ideas. Right-wing evangelicals one reason they support this big lie is because right-wing evangelicalism has an underpinning and always had underpinning of white nationalism and racism. I mean, look, they put one of the greatest racists on the political scene in office, and they're also they're white nationalists. They're white Christian nationalists. They're really about their vision. What right-wing evangelicals' vision of America is one in which their ideas are ascendant, and when you look at them, almost all of them, except for a few backward Negroes, are white. And so it is about whiteness and supporting whiteness. And that's what the attack on critical race theory is. It is about hiding the misdeeds of white America so they can look like they are innocent and like black people are just whining for nothing.
In your book, Christians Against Christianity, you take a great deal of time to talk about the challenge of injustice, or certainly the absence of justice in many churches. And you share the tension between, or the tension that America is facing when it comes to Christianity and what it really stands for. One of the questions that we have here, and I'd like for you to dovetail into your book, Christians Against Christianity, the question on the floor that someone's raising is, what is your vision of the future of democracy in America, particularly with the real challenge that the right is building in voting, crush the Democratic stronghold in the House, because they really are mounting. They're saying that they're going to sweep both houses.
Yeah. In my personal opinion, and I've paid a lot of attention to this because I teach about democracy. I've been teaching about it for a while, and I think that America has seen the high point of democracy because the forces of anti-democracy are able to get away with doing things that we would not have dreamed of just a short period of time ago. And so when you have a political party that represents a major portion, they don't represent, well, as polls say, they don't represent the majority of Americans, but when you have a party that represents a near majority anyway of Americans who willing to support policies that strike at the heart of democracy, and that is about limiting people's right and opportunity to vote. When you have that happening, then that signals the demise of democracy. Right-wing evangelicals who have the ear of the Republican Party and have so many millions behind them, they're not about democracy. They're about theocracy. Theocracy is that they want to rule the country, the body politic, as they claim God is telling them to. And, the question we would ask, well, what God is that? It's not the God of the Bible. So I'm not sanguine, hopeful at all about democracy, but I do think if we in the church would stand up and do what we are supposed to do, to fight for freedom, to lean on our representatives, to run folk who believe in justice. And I mean, really, really lean on these folks, show up all of the time, make life difficult for them, and demonstrate that most people do not support this anti-democratic turn, then maybe we can stop it. But until we become more energetic and more dedicated to living out the strictures of the Bible that tell us to stand against injustice, until we do that, this anti-democratic turn, we see getting stronger every day. I believe it's going to continue to get stronger. It's a scary thing, for our grandchildren, great-grandchildren. It's scary. This is a dangerous, dangerous time, and I hope our folks in our churches wake up and look at it. This is more dangerous than the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement mainly was the people who were demonstrating, who were in danger. But we're all going to be on the firing line at some point.
So, one more question. Let me just give a little commentary in the beginning. In the trial with Ahmaud Arbery, it appears as if it feels like it's like an Emmett Till jury, number one, when you look at the jurors with only one African American, and then one of the lawyers stands and says, we don't need any black preachers in the courtroom. Number two, when we look at the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, and he literally shoots two people to death, one person shot 4 times with an automatic rifle at the age of 17, and then he shoots another. Yet many are saying because he wept like a baby and he's pulled the strings of white America, so he too may get off free. I guess the question that we have to raise, the world that we once recognized as a Judeo-Christian society, has it fallen off the edge of the earth? Has it gone into the great abyss where preachers are not allowed to even come into a courtroom, and white preachers are supporting the murderer of 2 people and the sheer violence of another?
I mean, so the question is, what's the question? Yeah, well, I hear you. It's hard, you know, to articulate the question, you know. But that's the point. Is, I mean, doesn't it look like we're going backward? And that's the point. And I folk need to pay attention. And first of all, there's little question that Kyle Rittenhouse is going to get off. I mean, you know, he had so much support around the country anyway. They raised hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to support him. Folk made a hero of him and all that. He, you know, that's sick, but it gives a tone of the country. Ahmaud Arbery. Oh my God! I mean, it does recall Emmett Till, and the judges are the judge in that trial is biased, and it's like something that, you know, something out of the 50s. But again, this signals to us how bad things are getting. And there's no hue and cry being raised. Folks should be saying, oh my God, remove his behind from that judgeship. And how can you say, he didn't say we don't want any more pastors. We don't want any more black pastors. He says it in the church, I mean, in the courtroom. And he's not censored for it. No, brother, these are all signs that we better get our thing together. They're trying, I mean, white folks are telling us, look, we got something for you all. And we, you know, too many folk are praying and looking elsewhere and not paying attention. You know, God didn't say that, you know, to just pray. You know, you know, I mean, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. That means we got to struggle on the ground, you know, and it's not all about, you know, giving honor to God as the head of my life, and I'm working on my individual salvation. We got to struggle and fight, and it's so disappointing to see that so many churches are not doing that. They're not even thinking about doing that. And to the extent that we don't fight back, that is to the extent that we're going to suffer. And it's extremely frightening to me.
Thank you. I think we may have one more question. So the last question is, how, as you look around the world, we would at one time would say that the number one religion would be Christianity. Many now say the fight is between Judaism, not Judaism, but Muslim or Islam and Christianity. Some would say Islam has outpaced Christianity. And then others would say that, at least our social scientists, me coming out of USC, that there are nunners, and the nunners are a rather large group. Well, I don't believe in any of your organized religion. How does the world see Christianity today? And I really am asking an academic question. How does the world see Christianity today in America?
Yeah, and it's important to specify in America because, you know, so much of what I've read, and I've talked to people who've been abroad, and they're like, man, what the heck is happening in your country? I mean, and these right-wing Christians, how do they call themselves Christians? But Christianity in America, because the right-wing evangelicals are the loudest and the most empowered segment of Christians, they are representative of American Christianity to so many people around the world. I mean, I've actually had people say, we feel sorry for you all. We had no idea that America had fallen so far. But that is why these right-wing evangelicals, these white evangelicals, what they're doing, they are anti-Christian. They are actively anti-Christian in that their actions and their pronouncements are actively misportraying what Christianity is, what Jesus taught, and who Jesus was. And in this sense, like 1 John talks about it, they are pervaded and imbued, the right-wing evangelicals, with a spirit, what 1 John calls a spirit of Antichrist. Spirit of Antichrist as people teaching the opposite of what Jesus taught, but doing it in the name of Jesus. This is evil, it's blasphemy, and again, it's something that we should be talking about and not letting these people define who they are, but they are defining who we are in the public square. And because those who choose to practice, who at least want to try to live out the gospel as Jesus taught it, are not standing up and defending it. That is our fault. And not only that, but when you talk about Muslims, how does that look to Muslims? We're talking about Muslims. Well, first off, America is seen to be anti-Islamic because of that creep Trump and his folks. But then, they look at right-wing Christians and they're saying, wow, these folk aren't, Christianity in America is not about anything. It's not about doing anything but oppressing people. We're letting them get off scot-free to our detriment, brother. And it's very exhausting and very upsetting.
Religion is the opiate of the masses. Does that know, or are there any other questions that you would like to raise?
Brief overview of Christians against Christianity. You've written a book recently on that. That's available as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Elder. Presiding elders asked me to talk for a moment about my latest book, Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. And I got to tell you, the book is fire. I'm not bragging. I'm like an old TV show, the Western, The Sons of Will Sonnet. He used to say, no brag, just fact. I wrote the book to expose all of the very specious and distorted, readings of the Bible that white-wing evangelicals are misusing to oppress and hurt people. And they're misleading people against the way of doing justice in God's world. And so I actually began the book, I shared a little yesterday, I began the book by making a distinction between the kind of Christianity we grew up in the Black community with what these folk call Christianity today. And it's not, my brother's saying to show that, yeah, you're right, brother, let me show it. My grandmother said, how do they say it? It's a poor something. That's right, poor dog doesn't wag his own tail. I ain't a dog, but I'm gonna wag it. And so I wanted to make a distinction between Black Christianity, which is really based on love and acceptance, right, with right-wing evangelical Christianity or mainstream white Christianity, which throughout the history of America has had an oppositional dimension. They've been against this one or that one, or they've denigrated Black folks and all that. I mean, it's never really been love-based. There's always been a dimension where it was fighting against, opposing the equal treatment of someone. And so I look at various issues. I look at how they distort the teachings of the church, of the Bible on immigration. the Bible says over and over again, take care of immigrants, look out for immigrants. It says to make provision for immigrants until they can take care of themselves. And even Malachi even says that one of the reasons for tithing is to help take care of immigrants. What do? They act like immigrants are the lowest thing on earth. I talk about how in the book how right-wing evangelicals demonize and dehumanize same-gender loving folks in the LGBTQ community, and they claim that the Bible says that it is same-gender loving is a sin. But what I show is that when you look at the handful of passages that try to discredit same-gender loving people, when you look at them in context and you translate them correctly from the Hebrew and the Greek, what they mean is much too ambiguous to be able to say that the Bible says that same-gender loving is a sin. Not only that, Jesus said for us to love. He didn't say who you should love as long as you do love. And there's so much more to it that I show in there that, and for folk, I can understand there are folk who grew up with cultural notions and problems against homosexuality. I grew up, very homophobic in my, in the streets, but cultural notions do not trump biblical teachings. And the Bible teaches that we are to love one another and accept one another. Matthew 25:31-46 says that the way we have to judge one another is whether you're trying to love another, take care of another, do justice to another, do right. It doesn't say anything about who you sleep with and all that. I also deal with abortion. I don't make any judgments about abortion, but as a biblical scholar, I want to look at what the Bible says about it. And I show that the Bible never says anything really about abortion. The only time it comes close, it says if you hit if men are fighting and they strike a pregnant woman and she miscarries or the child is killed, that the law of an eye for an eye applies to the woman. But when it comes to the fetus, they have to pay a financial fine. In other words, they make a distinction between a human being and a fetus. The Bible does that. And the only other place we have anything even near abortion, it says that when a woman is suspected of being pregnant, a married woman is suspected of being pregnant by someone other than her husband, that she should be subject to some tests, and if like drinking bitter water and some other things. And if she's found to be guilty, that God will abort her fetus. So the only intentional abortion we have in the Bible is a divine abortion, right? And I talk about those things in the book, but I talk about the NRA and how the NRA has co-opted the gospel, for its purposes, and saying that gun rights are God-given and crazy stuff like that, and on down the line. So what I really tried to do is I've said, kiddingly, but I guess I mean it seriously. I've tried to kill everything standing with regard to the lies that right-wing evangelicals are giving, and to write and to offer a book as a resource for teaching our people and opposing the right-wing claims.
You talk about how white evangelicals have fallen in love with Jesus by way of a personality cult versus propagating the gospel of Jesus Christ. Could you explain?
Yes, sir, brother. Folk have forgotten personality. A Jesus personality cult exists when people are more concerned about focusing on the person of Jesus than they are on his teachings. And Jesus said to follow him. It might be hard to fathom, but he didn't say to worship him. He said worship God. He said follow him. That means pay attention to what he taught and to what he modeled. And too many Christians do not do that at all. It's all about Jesus. I once served with years ago, the pastor who would end his sermon sometimes saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And the people get worked up. I'm saying to myself, yeah, but what did Jesus do, man? I mean, what is the significance that you're trying to get across? And so it is the teachings of Jesus that we should be focusing on. The teachings, his teachings, what he did, and not just focusing on him and his sufferings. Not only that, Jesus didn't want people to focus on. He was so God, deeply imbued with God consciousness, that it's like his personality didn't exist. He said, when you see the Father, you see me. It was like he was just totally a totally, God intoxicated man. Which meant his personality, he wasn't concerned about his personality. He was concerned about poor people, who we talked about more than anything else. So when we focus on his personality, then we're not focusing on what he wants us to focus on.
Man, I got so many questions. I have two more, and then I'd love to give it back to the presiding elder. Two questions. One, when we think about what you've done with the least of these, you've done to me. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? And then when we think about Luke chapter 4, verse 18, echoing Isaiah chapter 61, we really do think about a social justice ministry. Yet last year, there were several articles written from Dallas Theological Seminary, as well as Fuller Theological Seminary, that suggest that the social gospel is not a part of the Bible. As a matter of fact, it's antithetical to the Bible. Could you explain?
Yeah, that's very unfortunate, man. I mean, it's just ridiculous. What's that? John MacArthur wrote that letter, co-signed by 10,000 evangelical pastors, that social justice is unbiblical, and he couldn't be more wrong. Social justice, and I deal with this in a full chapter in Christians Against Christianity. Show that, in a nutshell, the most often occurring ethical term in the Bible is misprice, justice. That shows up more than any other term. It's important for all preachers to know, because if that's the most important ethical term in the Bible, it should be an important part of our preaching as well, right? I mean, come on, And the second most often occurring is tzedakah, which is translated as righteousness, but it doesn't mean just personal piety. It means more than that. It means doing right in society, because they didn't have a notion of individuality in those days. So it was doing right in society. And what's doing right in society? It's putting justice into action in society. So when you put the two together, as the Bible does more than any other pair of terms at all, what you get is doing justice in society, which is social justice, which is the basic foundation of the Bible, which means that our efforts are to be for the uplift of our neighbors, because and the community, because that includes all of us. And if we work for the community rather than individuals, that's the basis of love. That's the basis of health and healthiness and security. So social justice is, and Jesus used the term dikaiosune, which is often translated as righteousness, but again, Jesus wasn't about individualism. Dikaiosune is also translated as justice. So when he says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and its dikaiosune, and its justice, and all things will be added unto you, we have to take that seriously. And Luke 4:18 gives us a sense of what justice is. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. What's good news to the poor? That the institutions, the structures, the laws, the relationships that make people poor and keep them poor, Jesus was heralding the need for them to be changed. So, we have to reorient the way we look at the Bible, and move away from misunderstandings of Paul, and realize that it is about fighting for the the whole community, and not just, looking to work out our own personal salvation, because as we've talked about, as you know, that's just the vertical, giving honor to God, but ignoring the horizontal, which is loving neighbor to yourself. Love your Lord your God, all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. If all we're doing is this, we don't have a cross, right? And not only that, you can do that and walk out and spit on somebody because they stand in your way at the church. It's not a holistic way of looking at things. If one is not concerned, and the other thing is the only real evidence of spirituality, of loving God, is how we treat other people in the world. And if we're not treating other people in the world, I don't care how much you come to church, how much you pray, you're not in touch with the Spirit of the Lord. I'm getting ready to preach it, so let me leave that alone. I hope that.
And this is the final question. Your friend Eddie Glaude would suggest in his seminal piece, maybe 5 years ago, that the Black church is dead. Shakes up the whole country because many would say, no, the Black church is not dead, it's still alive. Yet the Black church leaned towards white evangelicalism and Eddie Glaude's criticism of that. And I agree that salvation, while it is personal, is never private. It was never meant for the individual. How then do we deal with pastors who fail to deal with the cultural realities of the day? Because Jesus dealt with it, and many would say, James Cone said that Jesus was a failure. Jesus did not win in ministry. Jesus was crucified as an embarrassment to Judaism, and no good living Jew will ever follow Jesus because of the way he died. So why then, here's my question, then why are we using secular systems to measure ministry? How big is your church? How much budget do you have? How many people are in your pew? Versus Jesus, who died a failure in ministry, according to James Cone.
Yeah. Let me just do real quick. Eddie Glaude's a dear friend of mine. Eddie was horrified with that title. He didn't choose that title. Huffington Post gave him that title, and he took some lumps. Some lumps, but he doesn't believe the Black church is dead at all. What do we say to
James Cone suggests, and others? He was even stated today by Dr. Wiley that we are using secular systems, and we have this fear of failure. Where in the 21st century, certainly in B school, failing is something that is celebrated, and you fail forward. Jesus failed.
Okay.
Yet we are afraid, as many pastors, to preach cultural challenges because it's not safe.
Right,
it's not safe.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, I think, a misunderstanding that Jesus didn't start a church, right? He started a movement, right? And he didn't start an institution, and he didn't model a lot of what has become the norm in ministry. Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head, right? He said, I'm broke as a stroke, and and that doesn't mean that servants and pastors are supposed to be broke. He's not. Because he was concerned about poor people, so of course he didn't want people to be poor. But the point was that the main reason for his ministry was not to get rich, and was not as a profession, but as a calling. And today, as you know, everybody says they're called, but that some folk I know that Reverend Hildebrand used to always say, some of them just got up and went, right? But too many folks see it as just another profession, like being an engineer or something, and that's all right as long as they're honest about it. But what that means, though, is that they are concerned about the quantitative. They're concerned about being celebrity preachers, for instance. They're concerned about doing the things that are going to raise maximum money and get maximum followers, and that is not necessarily struggling to make this a just world. Now there are exceptions to that, of course, but And it also comes from a lack of real knowledge, again, of what the Bible calls us to do. A lot of folk just will not, they ignore the fact that Jesus started a movement to change the world. And that's why you don't see them moving, don't see them doing anything really, I mean, except institutional maintenance and doing the kinds of things that would make people shout so folk could keep coming back. And I'm going to say this, and I mean no harm, but a lot of pastors got to realize that being a pastor is not a status. It's just a role. It doesn't make you above anybody else. And it's the same with the episcopacy. It's just a role. It doesn't make you above everyone else. Though in the past, I guess less now, hopefully, but in the past, folks seem to not have understood that. And not too many bishops actually taught that either. But anyway, that's another thing. I can say these things because I'm not looking for a church. But yeah, I'm in trouble now. But yeah, really, it is all about understanding and taking responsibility for the gospel, taking it seriously, and not playing with it. And a lot of folk are playing. They didn't realize they're playing. And so, those who know better need to help to raise consciousness, That's the only reason I became a biblical scholar, to be able to share the little bit that I could figure out, to share with my brothers and sisters in the ministry, because I saw too many Black people in the church all the time who still are suffering on all kinds of levels. So we must do better. If we're going to be shepherds of the flock, then let's really be shepherds and protect the people of our flock, and not just entertain them.
Praise the Lord, everybody. Come on, let's give God a big hand clap wherever you are. We thank the Lord for Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks. Wasn't that a marvelous presentation? Thank you so much for sharing with us your knowledge and your scholarly outlook, and for encouraging us. And I must say, as you made the Episcopal comment that some see it as a status and not as a role, but we want to thank God for our servant bishop. Our servant bishop esteems himself by energetically providing a level of ministry, impactful ministry, affecting lives, giving us creative ways to keep our churches vibrant, focusing on aspects of Christianity and of our world, such that we grow, such that we get the support we need, such that we are mindfully tended to. And so I thank you for making that observation, but also reinforcing, and I know that you would want to also affirm that we have a servant bishop in the Second Episcopal District. His name is the Right Reverend James Levert Davis, and we're just honored to have him. We're so glad he came back from the General Conference. We just don't know what to do. And so as we move forward, we thank you, Bishop, for the opportunity to serve, to be a middle manager. One thing we're certain about is that only a strong leader would allow a subordinate to provide a level of creative leadership that would augment and support and also reinforce the vision of our leaders. So I want to thank you. I don't take it lightly, being a middle manager and having this opportunity to serve. I also want to really thank I'll come right at you. I want to thank God for our host pastor and co-hosts who came together to do a marvelous job. I want to thank God for the Reverend Dr. Mark Whitlock. He's all in. He's given himself to this effort. I can't tell you how hard he's worked, along with the Reverend Dr. Michael Bell. They both put together a conference that is second to none. We really thank the Lord for them and for Reed Temple AME Church. My God, the level of hospitality that they rendered, the tech team that put all this together. We're not smart enough. We don't have the capability to do what John Moody does, to do what Jennifer does, to do what all the many persons do to do what they do. And so we thank God for all of this. We thank God for I'm gonna definitely talk about Alicia. Well, thank God for. I'm gonna get the. Sometimes you gotta say the best for last. But listen, I want to thank all of the speakers. We had some dynamic speakers, along with the Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks Jr. I want to thank God for Dr. Jacoby Wilson. I pray that you were blessed through the climate change conversation as well as the discussion about environmental justice. We want to thank God also for the amazing encouragement that we receive to continue to stand, to believe, to advocate, and to hold up the bloodstained banner. We were blessed by conversations by our host pastor and our co-host pastor. We've been blessed in so many ways by so many people. And so I just want to give God the highest praise and to honor him for blessing us. We had the Watleys. Good God from Zion. I want to thank God for the Reverend Dr. William and soon to be Dr. Matthew Watley. Both of them as a tag team came on Wednesday night and they just blew the house up. We thank God for the word that they preached and the way they came on Thursday and today and led us in plenary sessions. We've been blessed. And so we want to thank God for you and you and you and all of the many persons that participated. It wouldn't have been anything if you hadn't come to join us. So let me thank you so much. Dr. Aubrey Hendricks wants to make the point. He loves all the bishops. He wanted to make the point that he wants to affirm that the AME Church would not be the AME Church, and he wants to talk, but we got to roll out. I know you want to say something, but we got to.
Let me say it for myself.
He's trying to sell some books, so he needs to say something. Come on and say something, brother.
I would like to say, I mean, you did encapsulate much I wanted to say. One thing that I can say, and I've said it to Mark, it is so heartening to see what's been happening with the AME Church and various relatively new, bishops that we have. I mean, I've known, Reginald Jackson for like 40 years or something. He was a freedom fighter way back. And I've heard those exact same things you're saying about Bishop Davis, heard those things. I'm really encouraged. I'm encouraged by the Christian Recorder. My God, it's getting up there to be world class again. Teresa Fry Brown and all that she's doing. But also, you talked about how the bishop gave you room to have a program like this. I mean, the speakers you had, Dr. Wadley is a world class intellect. His son Matthew is a brilliant young man. I missed some of them, but you have academics come in. And this is a wonderful thing because it's so obvious that you're working to raise consciousness about the kinds of issues that impact our lives, but that so many churches don't pay attention to. So it's just I want to affirm you and thank God for Bishop Davis and thank God for where the AME Church is going. And I'm thankful that I can be a small part of it. I am the most widely read Black biblical scholar this country's ever seen by virtue of the breadth of the reading of my books and my writings. I'm not bragging. What I'm saying is that I bring all of that and all that I am to this effort, and I call on my brothers and sisters, use me, and that's what I'm here for. And so I'm a freedom fighter.
But Dr. Hendricks, we claim you, and we're so thankful that you are AME.
I am too.
To the bone, and we did not say that you were former president of Payne Theological Seminary, and so we claim you, and we thank God for you. And as we prepare to roll out, please know that tonight we're having a closing worship service. My God, we've got 5 preachers who are going to preach to the glory of God, just 5 to 7 minutes apiece. So we're not going to be here all night, but they're going to preach the 5 I am statements of Jesus Christ. And we're going to shout and have a hallelujah good time. You can join us virtually, but also there's an opportunity to come in person. You got to bring that vaccination card if you want to get in, or you can watch us on Facebook or YouTube. But anyway, come on and stay with us, be with us. Take a break now. We all of us need to refresh ourselves. We need to check in and check up. But at 7 o'clock, come on back in the house so that we can have a hallelujah good time. Now, it's important to us that you give us some feedback on how we did. We need for you to evaluate. There's a QR code that's going to come up, and the purpose of it is we want to continue to follow our bishop's leadership. Our bishop is tireless. He's the hardest working man that I've ever seen in my life. And even when I try to keep up with him, I can't keep his pace because our bishop is forward thinking. And he's so forward thinking, he's such a servant leader that mediocrity is never and no longer acceptable on any way. And so we want to thank God for our wonderful bishop. We want to evaluate what we're doing so that we can do better. We want to magnify God. We want to glorify him. And we want to make it clear to our bishop that we see him, we honor him, we thank God for him, and we're doing what the Lord has called us to do to affirm the themes and the initiatives that he has. And so are we able to put the QR code up on the screen? Is up. Hit that QR code. It's going to give you an evaluation. You'll be able to give us some feedback. Chat back at us if you enjoyed yourself. Chat back and tell Dr. Hendricks how much you appreciate him. Chat back and ask him, where can you get this book? I believe it's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. You can get this book all over the world. And so as we prepare to leave, God bless you. Pray the Lord will continue to smile on you. And we'll see you back here at 7 o'clock. Somebody shout hallelujah. Chat hallelujah. And then God bless you. We'll see you soon.